saying that we need to see the existential threat that this Premier placed tenants under this weekend. We need to identify it for what it was. And that was and still is an existential threat. The Premier owes the people of Ontario an apology for threatening their housing by threatening to place the scrapping of the security of tenure and effectively ending rent control as we know it in Ontario. And I'd like to see the Premier's inbox, because I had a difficult time managing my own, because it was packed, absolutely packed, Speaker, with tenants who are telling me about the security of tenure. And Speaker, I should say that I'm going to be sharing my time with a good member of Ottawa Centre. Thank you for that. You know, there are so many tenants right now that are struggling in Ontario. And when the government put forward a briefing note that highlighted how they were going to go further to make life more unaffordable for Ontario renters, of course people were alarmed. I received over, I think, 3,000 emails alone, just 3 days. And I would imagine that the Premier and the government members, especially the cabinet members, would have received comparable numbers, if not more. The Premier then walked back, or the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing walked back on the briefing note suggestion that they were going to go into consultation on this particular egregious piece around erosion of rent control. And he sends out a tweet, a social post on Sunday evening, and says, no, we're not going to do anything like that right now. Now, I just want to highlight that this government has a history of walking back on horrible legislation, whether it's the Greenbelt or Bill 28. If you'll recall, in 2022, that was an attack on education workers' constitutional rights when the government was going to impose an agreement upon them. So essentially taking away their collective bargaining rights and their right to strike. And the government pushed that bill through in 3 days, and then they had to come back in 11 days and said, oops, we made a mistake. We're going to pass it. We're going to repeal it altogether. So I don't think the government has a lot of credibility when it comes to putting forward legislation that hasn't been well thought out, or they thought that they can get away with it, and then they had to backtrack. Now, I just gave the Municipal Affairs, the Minister of Housing, an opportunity to clarify his position once again, because this morning, the minister said that he didn't say that he would not proceed for now. He just said it's not in the bill. Sure, it's not exactly laid out in the bill, but if you put it in the briefing note and you announce to the world that you're going to go to consultations and have conversations with the public about it, then you had intentions to move it forward. So I'm going to venture out and say that this government is probably going to bring it back. So we are going to be on high alert, because people in Ontario, especially renters, they are struggling around the cost of housing, and we are not going to be fooled, and they certainly will not be fooled. So the bill has 12 schedules, Speaker, and I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of pieces I think need to be highlighted. Number 4, the Schedule 4, where the bill is specifically talking about transit. So right now, the bill is talking about the creation of a new transit station development charge, which is odd, coming from a government that claims housing is not being built because municipal development charges are simply too high. It's quite hypocritical for the government to be limiting municipalities' ability to use development charges to pay for municipal infrastructure, while obligating those same municipalities to level new development charges to pay for provincial infrastructure. And so let us be reminded that it is this government that's quietly stopped funding the GO stations in 2018, and that was reported in Trillium, as we know that local municipalities are now required to fundraise for their own GO stations. Why are we calling them GO stations? We just named them after local municipalities. Transit station charges are new development charges that were enabled in Bill 133 in 2023, and regulations that came forward in 2025. Those charges are intended to allow municipalities to fundraise for GO stations. So once again, Everything points to the fact that this government is downloading onto municipalities and asking them to do so much more, including building regional transit. I'm going to just highlight that in a case in Toronto, the Metrolinx transit-oriented communities is based on that same premise. And yet recently we've seen the collapse around Park Lawn and Mimico transit-oriented developments and community have now been called into question because that scheme of asking the local municipalities to fundraise for transit is simply not working. I'm going to move to Schedule 10 around the Planning Act. All ministerial decisions under this act and not just municipal zoning orders, no longer need to be consistent with the provincial policy statements. The government is essentially exempting themselves from following local planning rules under the provincial policy statement. That means the sustainable neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that allow us to have consultation, to build out better, more inclusive, dynamic neighborhoods that are prosperous. The government is saying those rules don't apply to them. But at the same time, we've seen them triple down on MZOs. We haven't had a conversation about MZOs since the beginning of this new session, but let us be on high alert that that's what the minister is now proposing will happen, is that these new ministerial zoning orders will no longer be considered regulations, and they don't need to be part of any of the Legislation Act, including its rules for filing and publications. MZOs will still be published on a government website. However, the timeline for the publication is not specified. What we have here is a bit of mystery, and the government is giving themselves far more power and overreach into how municipalities are going to grow. Schedule 12 talks about the Residential Tenancies Act, and this is the piece that's actually causing a lot of concern. We heard the Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister talk about all the things that will happen in developing supply. And then we heard the Attorney General speak about all the good things that are now going to take place at the Landlord-Tenant Board and how everything is going to be sped up. What's going to be sped up in Ontario are evictions. What's going to happen with these changes that we're seeing through Bill 60 is the silencing of tenants. I'm curious to know, Speaker, is who on earth did this government consult on the Residential Tenancies Act, as well as any changes prescribed to the Landlord-Tenant Board? Because from what I see, it's very heavily favoring big corporate landlords and doing very little to protect renters, who are really the workers of Ontario. And let us never forget that. Speaker, I've had experiences myself as a renter. I know how difficult it is to make sure that you can make the monthly rent. And I will also say, Speaker, is that my family has been renters for a long, long time, for decades in Canada, before my mom and dad were able to scrape by, put together a small amount of money, and place a deposit on a very modest, run-down house. And Speaker, that is the story of so many people. And yet, the options of home ownership, as we know, are slipping away every single day faster than anybody can catch it. So there's going to be more Ontarians who are going to be renters, including Ontarians who are children of the folks who are here in the legislature. So anytime you put forward legislation that's damaging to tenants, that are going to disadvantage tenants, guess what, Speaker? You're disadvantaging your children and your grandchildren, because that's what's happened as they're stuck in mom and dad's basement. Speaker, I want to talk about the fact that, the foundations to housing in Ontario and access to housing in Ontario is slipping away so fast. Everybody deserves access to safe, affordable, stable housing, but that foundation is quickly cracking. And it's one of the most powerful tools that we have that we can use to protect it is rent control. Speaker, rent control is not just an economic policy. It is literally a lifeline. It ensures that tenants aren't priced out of their communities, that families can plan their futures, and that young people can imagine what life would look like in the cities and towns where they grew up. It's about making sure that Ontario remains livable for people who make this province work. That's why I said renters are workers. They're nurses, they're teachers, they're service workers, they're newcomers, they are seniors, everybody who's working so hard to contribute, including the students and the next generation that is giving up hope. Because not only can they not find a job, as we know that the crisis sits in youth unemployment numbers are so high, Speaker, they can't find a home. And the government is now proposing legislation that's going to make it harder for them to keep their home as a tenant. For decades, rent control has helped keep housing within reach. But in recent years, these protections have been weakened and removed. In 2018, this government lifted rent control on most new buildings, giving developers a free pass to raise rents without limits. Imagine raising rents without limits. This government did it. Since then, tenants have been facing double-digit increases year after year. And I have heard those stories, Speaker, when I was canvassing my own community, when tenants would come to the door and they told me that they have faced 20%, 30%, and 40% rent hikes. Can anybody here tell me whether or not they can pay their mortgage if all of a sudden it went up 20%, 30%, or 40%? You would say no, but you would protect yourself, but you won't protect tenants. Shame. This is not a healthy housing market. It's a crisis, and nearly half of Ontarian renters are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. This is the official definition of unaffordability. This government has stopped talking about affordable housing. What they talk about is something called attainable houses. Attainable housing. Well, guess what? It's not attainable, it's not affordable. You aren't bringing forward the solutions that Ontarians need. Rent control, we know, restores balance to communities. It helps prevent unfair and sudden rent hikes, curb displacement. It gives tenants the opportunity to build the lives and raise their families, have a heart. We're talking about making sure that we can keep our province prosperous, and we can't do that without a workforce that lives here and that wants to live here and that can afford to live here. We know that these are such critical conversations, and I really wish that this government would give tenants a fair hearing, because that needs to be considered. Because this government talks about workers, well, guess what? Workers are tenants. And the majority of workers are tenants. This government has gone further to claim that rent control discourages new construction, but the evidence shows exactly the opposite. Ontario built plenty of rental housing when rent control existed. What drives construction is public investment, strong planning, political will, not giving landlords a blank check by removing rent control. You're going to drive the workforce out of Ontario. And if we want that Ontario to be livable, not just for the wealthy, but for everyone else, then what we have to do is strengthen rent control, close the loopholes, and tie it exactly to the unit and not just the tenant. Every home should be built and free from exploitation, no matter when it was built. And because we know that a home is not a Louis Vuitton bag, it's not a luxury, Speaker, it's a human necessity. And we know it's a human right. And without rent control, you won't have that essential necessity, the shelter and housing that we all need in order for us to live a life that's full of dignity. Ontario is blessed with many tenant organizations, and I have had a chance over my public life and career to work with some of the very best, whether it's Acorn or ACTO, the Advocacy Center for Tenants in Ontario. They spent the weekend, along with many others, including the York Southwestern Tenants Union. They were sounding the alarm. And the reason why the Minister of Housing sent out a Sunday night tweet saying, not now, something about balancing the market, it's because the tenants rose up. And the tenants will continue to rise up against Bill 60 because it is horrible, cruel, legislation that will lead to mass human suffering. It's a humanitarian disaster in the making as you plan to speed up evictions and remove the rights of tenants at the landlord-tenant board. What we know is that the landlord-tenant board has been broken by this government. Yes, it was never perfect under the Liberals. You walked into a situation in 2018 where the backlog was sitting at 20,000, and then you made it significantly worse by letting those numbers soar up to over 54,000. And now you're trying to bring it back down to 37,000. And I heard earlier that the Attorney General felt that a 30,000 case backlog was a good floating rate. In what world is a 30,000 case backlog at the tribunal system a good floating rate? That's ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous, because people are still waiting years for justice. And we know that the justice system, Speaker, you know this as a solicitor, has to work. So Bill 60 now proposes a number of reforms that are supposed to address the delays at the landlord-tenant board. These are changes that will undermine the fundamental tenant protections and create a false narrative that tenant rights are the reasons for the LTB delays. Somehow it's the tenant's fault that the LTB is broken, mismanaged, underfunded. The proposed changes would cut back on the ability of tenants to challenge an unjust eviction order with only 15 days to ask for review of an LTB order. In addition, the tenants will have only 7 days now instead of 14 days to pay their rent before the landlord can apply to the LTB for the non-payment, which of course, as we know, is way too fast. You know, all of this is leading to the conditions that will make it nearly impossible for tenants to keep their housing. And all of this is actually eroding into the human rights and the legal rights of tenants in Ontario. These changes will only go further to restrict the tenants' access to justice and we know that this will lead to further evictions and further displacement. Bill 60 it shows us a disregard for eviction prevention and it totally ignores the housing crisis. Bill 60 talks about the Residential Tenants Act, speaks about planning, even makes big mention here about the Landlord-Tenant Board, but this is not a housing strategy, and there is nothing in here about increasing supply, despite the government's talk that supply will be increased. What we do know is that Ontario is experiencing a homelessness crisis. As we know, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario have highlighted that right now over 81,500 people in Ontario are homeless. Speaker, 81,500 people. That's larger than most of the towns in Ontario. And it's worse because it's growing. Like the number has now increased 25% since 2022. My goodness, why are we not talking about housing and how to build more housing as opposed to putting forward a plan that this government has put forward to evict people faster into further homelessness? The homelessness crisis extends far beyond urban centers, and I've learned this by speaking to members here who come from the north, who live in rural communities, and I've heard from those members, including government members, about how high the homelessness rate is in their own community, and I've heard as high as 50%. Speaker, half the town, half the village is unemployed, is homeless. And how is that not a crisis? Undermining the security of tenure as this government proposed is only going to facilitate faster evictions. And with the growing threat of job losses due to tariffs, workers are now facing more hardship than ever before. Speaker, you know, the changes that this government has put forward is simply going to speed up evictions as we know it. I wanted to share a few stories because I think stories from our residents are important. And as I mentioned, my inbox was full of these stories this weekend. And I want to share the stories of people who wrote to explain what they were going through and what they have been going through under this broken system. So one of those stories is from a renter who lives in Toronto Centre. And he's writing this letter from his rent control apartment that he's been renting since 2021. He says that when I first heard about Bill 60 last night at my friend's place in the Beaches, we all got scared. Some of us are from small towns in Ontario. Some of us grew up in the suburbs of the GTA. Some of us grew up right here in Toronto in some of the roughest neighborhoods. Collectively, we've been renting in Ontario for over 5 decades. Most of us will never own. I'm the only person in this friend group who has a glimmer of that possibility, in large part because I'm privileged enough to have inherited some family support. The other part is I've been able to save only because I live in a rent-controlled apartment. However, it hasn't been easy or without threats from my landlord. From the moment my first year in this unit, my landlord has been trying to get me out or raise my rent exorbitantly. The first year, it was an attempt to raise my rent by 30% because the market had changed, quote unquote. We were coming out of the pandemic and he was trying to push me to sign a brand new lease at a new price instead of letting things go month to month. It was clear that my landlord and her property manager were banking on me not knowing my rights as a tenant. Then came the incessant questions about how long I planned to stay in this unit. For another year, they asked for more rent, and they kept trying to raise the rent above the provincial guidelines. And now, 4 months later, after all of this, they receive an N12. And now they've been fighting this N12 speaker since April of last year. They've hired a lawyer, this tenant has, and he's had to learn all about the Residential Tenancies Act and N12s more than he's ever needed to know before. He has no doubt that his landlord is one of the greediest landlords who will benefit from this bill. And he is confident that should this bill pass, he's going to be evicted as soon as possible. Let me share with you a story by a constituent whose name is Mo. He texted this over. This tenant has lived in a mixed-use building with 10 units. He has been refusing an illegal rent increase. And when he does that, the landlord retaliates with leaks and flooding and harassment. No gas, no heat in January. The tenant was forced to accept, quote unquote, cash for keys deal that was never paid out as required by law. They filed some paperwork at the LTB. The Landlord and Tenant Board doesn't hear it for 2 years, Speaker. The Landlord-Tenant Board called it an adjudicated case conference, not an actual hearing, so there's no real outcome. Then a clerical error took place, Speaker, at the LTB, and the case got tossed, and the tenants had to fight just to be heard. So, Speaker, I can go on because there are so many of these type of stories, and if I was to choose one more, I'm going to share this one very quickly. This is Ryan's story, Speaker. I'm a student on ODSB who can barely afford rent, and by passing this bill, this will create more systemic barriers of obtaining housing security for tenants like me. I understand the urgent need for more housing in Ontario. Bill 60 takes the wrong approach by cutting environmental and community oversight, by reducing the role of municipalities in development decisions, by prioritizing developer and landlord interests over public accountability. This legislation fails to ensure that the housing being built is affordable, sustainable, accessible to the people who need it most. Ontario's housing crisis, says Ryan, is not just a problem of supply. It's a problem of affordability. And without stronger rent control law, new construction will not solve the crisis that is faced by renters across the province because they are being priced out of their homes. The government's exemption 2018, post-2018 buildings from rent control have now forced the situation even further. Rents have skyrocketed, not come down, forcing Ontarians to constantly live in housing insecurity with the threat of displacement. Ryan says, if this government truly wants to make housing attainable, it must focus on protecting tenants by reinstating comprehensive rent control on all rental units, regardless of when they were built, strengthening enforcement against illegal evictions and rent evictions, expanding funding for nonprofit, cooperative, and public housing initiatives, ensuring that new development prioritizes affordable housing, not just market rate or luxury projects. Ryan wants this House to know that Bill 60 is a missed opportunity to address the root causes of the housing crisis. Ryan is calling on all of us to oppose Bill 60 and to advocate for legislation that guarantees affordability, stability, and dignity for renters across Ontario. And that includes renters who are living in the ridings of government members. And I want to appeal to those renters right now. I know you're scared because you contacted me, the downtown MPP in Toronto Centre. Like, I'm hearing from people in communities that I don't represent because they're saying that their government members are backing this legislation that they're so scared of. And they can't get through their government members. They don't understand why, as a renter, they're not seen in those communities. And as we are facing what will be some pretty hard economic challenges, Speaker, because it's already tough. It's already tough if you haven't seen wage increases. It's already tough when the grocery bills continue to rise and the fuel costs continue to rise and the housing costs continue to rise. Those renters in those communities living in government ridings are so scared. And they want the government members to know that they should represent them as well and to recognize how hard it is to make rent and recognize their struggle. And for all the talk about the government supporting workers, those renters in their communities have asked this government to recognize that those workers who are working 2 jobs, doing everything they can to pull it together to make ends meet, those renters are really crushed under this housing crisis. And they want to know, why would their government, why would their MPP and their government members put forward legislation that could land them in a path of eviction, of homelessness, when they're fighting so hard, Speaker? They're fighting tooth and nail to keep their housing. They want to know why the government would be so heartless to even consider removing the one tool in housing that will give them predictable, affordable rent. This is a serious issue that we need to grasp without any further delay. And Speaker, I'm going to conclude my remarks and thank all the people who have taken their weekend to call and fill my phone box and my inbox. I want to thank them for reaching out to us, and I want to thank them for keeping up the fight, because we know that despite what the government has said around Bill 60 and how it's not going to be harmful and how it's going to be good for everyone, they know differently, and they're coming. They're coming to committee, they're coming to this House, and they'll be coming